Hi there, Baden Hill hikers. It's time to hike on over to China. And just like India's partition, China's story is filled with sorrow. In fact, the title of this section, which is part 3 of our postcolonialism unit, the title is Eating Bitterness. In Chinese, they say 吃苦, and it literally means eating what's bitter, but it has to do with suffering. It has to do with the ability to keep moving, to keep living, even though things are difficult. And the Chinese people have suffered greatly over the centuries and the millennia, thousands of years, but they keep moving forward. And 5,000 years of Chinese civilization tell us that there's something about the geography of China and the culture of China that makes them keep going. And I want to learn a little bit more about that with you. So we'll begin with Chinese geography. And I'm going to try and make this as easy as I can, but it can get complicated, so please bear with me. And realize that I'm not expecting you to learn Mandarin by one of these videos, but I'm going to try and say some of these province names, and I'm going to hope that you can see some relationships. So instead of just memorizing a bunch of provinces and capitals of provinces, you get an idea of how things are described by the Chinese, because their language is very descriptive and the names they give things are very descriptive, but we wouldn't necessarily know that unless we know the meanings of the words. So let's start with two pairs of provinces, Shandong and Shanxi, and another pair is Hebei and Hunan. And let's treat them in order. Shandong literally means mountain east, or east of the mountains. And the mountains we're referring to are the Taihang Mountains, and it's in northern China. It's a part of the Les Plateau, and hopefully you'll be learning more about the Les Plateau and you'll understand what Les is. It's L-O-E-S-S, but it is basically yellow soil, fine yellow soil, and it leads us to say, yellow, we've heard that before. Yes, that is why the Yellow River is known as the Yellow River, the Huanghe. Okay, so Shandong is on the east, so Dong means east. Shanxi is west of those Taihang Mountains. And again, North and South China are different in character, and you need to know that most of China's population are found in the east, but even in the eastern portion, there's a division between north and south. So there are divisions in China. You have the east, where the rivers are making things fertile, and obviously you have mountains that are making those rivers run, and then beyond that you have more difficult land, very mountainous territory, and so most of the population lives in the east. So how is China divided north and south? There is a mountain range. It doesn't go all the way across China, but it's called the Qinling Shandi. Qinling Shandi is a knot. It's a big knot of mountains that kept people from always traveling back and forth between north and south. And so you have different cultures that develop, different dialects of the Chinese language, and you also have different politics that develop north and south. And sometimes the dynasties were divided, like the Song dynasty had a northern Song and southern Song. So that it's connected to the geography of China. So you have Shandong and Shanxi. You also have Hebei and Hunan. Hebei is, well, first of all, Bei is the same Bei in Beijing and also Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, and Bei means north. He is river, and so you can guess Yes, this is the Yellow River that we're talking about. So Hebei would be north of the Yellow River, and Hunan would be south of the Yellow River. And so you see these provinces in pairs, and it kind of helps you understand how everything's organized. It's very descriptive. There's also a series of provinces that connect to a reading of the Good Earth. And I know that reading the Good Earth, it can be very confusing because you have, first of all, it's a foreign language to most people. But even to Chinese speakers, they read it in English and they don't know what those words are, because Chinese isn't written with the English alphabet. And it has been written differently over the years. So reading the Good Earth, sometimes we're kind of confused. Two names come up in the Good Earth, Anhui and Jiangsu. Okay? Anhui and Jiangsu are actually two provinces in eastern China, and they're toward the north, toward Shandong, just below Shandong actually. And I should mention that north and south in China, meaning the east, okay, so the east part of China, you have the north, which is colder temperatures in the winter. It's actually more like the Midwest in the United States. We talked about that before. So Beijing is in the north, and it has very cold winters. They have snow there. And so when you read the Good Earth, you understand the kind of winters they're experiencing. But in the south of China, it's more tropical, and you have a lot of moisture. You have monsoon type moisture, and so you have the southwest monsoons, which come from the southwest in the summer, and then you have the northeast monsoons, which go the other direction in the winter. And so it's basically coming from those two directions, one at a time, and that is the monsoon pattern that affects India's climate so dramatically. Back in the old days, when people were trading on the Indian Ocean, they really could only travel one way for 6 months, and then they traveled the other way for 6 months until the inventors of the Muslim traders, they invented a new kind of sail called the lateen sail, and you could adjust it so that you could actually sail both ways, and it didn't matter what the monsoon winds were doing. Remember, a monsoon is not a typhoon. Typhoon is a sudden storm. A monsoon can be stormy at times, but mainly it's about a wind pattern that is long lasting, and it brings lots of moisture. So there are, of course, floods and disasters because of monsoons. Now, let's talk a little bit about Zhejiang. Zhejiang is that third of a cluster of provinces. You have Anhui, Jiangsu, and then Zhejiang, and it's basically all around the city of Shanghai. But nestled in there, a little more inland, is the city of Nanjing. And Nanjing is the city that Wang Long and Alan go to, the city in the south. Okay, so think of the north as being kind of like, Jiangsu or Anhui in the northern part, or Shandong. And they travel down to Nanjing because it's a big city. And Nanjing and Shanghai are quite close to each other, but Beijing is quite a bit further north, and it's a little bit more inland. It's not, like Shanghai on the ocean. So those are some general characteristics about those provinces. Let's go to Yunnan and Sichuan. Yunnan and Sichuan, those are two famous provinces. Honestly, a lot of China's provinces become famous because of the food that they export, and the type of food is known throughout China, and then everywhere that Chinese food goes. So you have Yunnan, which is very inland, and this was actually a place where during World War II, the Nationalist Army had to go there to kind of regroup. They went inland because it was more fortified. It wasn't as exposed as the seacoast to Japanese attack. So that's one thing you should know. Yunnan, it has some great natural beauty. I believe the city of Guilin is in that region. You also have Sichuan, which is just to the north of Yunnan. Sichuan is known for their spicy food. okay? And Sichuan is just right next to Tibet. So it's kind of the outer reach of China in some ways, because Tibet hasn't always been part of China. It goes back and forth if you look at history. And we need to talk about two other provinces that are a little bit inland, right next to Anhui and Shandong. Okay, you have Hubei and Hunan. And again, maybe you're hearing these words, Bei, again, like in Beijing, it means north. Beijing literally means northern capital, and Nanjing means southern capital. So we'll learn some of these Chinese vocabulary words. Hubei means to the north of the lake. And it's a fairly minor lake. It's just basically a shallow lake that comes from the Yangtze River. Okay, so you have the Huanghe in the north, and then you have the Yangtze Jiang, or the Yangtze River, the Yangtze River, that's more southern. And so Hunan is to the south of the river, Hubei and Hunan. You also have maybe some familiar sounding provinces. If you think about it for a little bit, Guangdong is actually Canton. Guangdong, Canton. That is really the main portal for China over the centuries. That was where ships came in from other countries, and they learned about China through Guangdong. It became a massive commercial area, and Hong Kong is right in the heart of Guangdong, right on the ocean, and the island of Kowloon. But remember that Canton was a city that was designated by the Emperor of China because it could be controlled, and foreign entry into China could be controlled. But what ended up happening is all of the merchants there were making a killing, and they were very corrupt. There was corrupt government officials who were making a ton of money. And the British and the foreigners didn't like that very much, and it led to the Opium Wars and the opening of Chinese ports. The other province on the coast there, just north of Guangdong, is Fujian. Now, both of these provinces are important. This is basically southern China. Fujian is the province just across from Taiwan. And the dialect that they speak in Fujian is the same dialect that they speak in Taiwan. As you can imagine, it's very much a fishing province, founded on its fishing industry because of its coastal position. And so one more is Jiangxi. Okay, Jiangxi, again, using Xi as a direction west, and Jiang meaning west of the river, western part. It's all connected to the Huanghe or the Yangtze Jiang. There's also a third river in China called the Xijiang, but I'm not going to expect you to remember everything. So Guangdong, Canton, Jiangxi, and then Fujian right on the coast across from Taiwan. Finally, we need to talk about 5 autonomous regions in China. And it's interesting to think about that, because autonomous means that they get to govern their own territory, kind of like the princely cities or the princely positions in India. They have autonomy, but obviously it's within limits. This is a communist, basically totalitarian government in many ways. They monitor everything. But if you look at a map, you see that Guangxi, and that is the western part of Guangdong. So Guangxi, it's again, you have Guangdong, which is east, and Guangxi, which is west. Dong, east, Xi, west. So it's all geographical and by the compass, right? That's on the southern part of China, and again, they have some autonomy. Inner Mongolia is in the very north of China, and it's separating Mongolia, the nation of Mongolia, from China. And Mongolia itself has been a buffer state. It has separated the Soviet Union or Russia from China, and this has been very important to keep the peace. Even though both of those nations were communist, They actually were rivals over the time that they were both communist. And so Mongolia is kind of this wild country in between. Remember, the Mongols did control China at one point, so there's a lot of relationship between Mongolia and China. But Inner Mongolia is the northernmost province of China, and that's, again, it's on the outskirts, the outside. Then you have Tibet, which literally in Chinese it's Xizang. It means it's in the west. And so the westernmost province is that high plateau. Before you get to the Himalayas, that's the Tibetan plateau. You have Ningxia, which is right in the center. Again, it's kind of a wild region right in the center of China, and it has some autonomy. And then you have Xinjiang. Xinjiang is kind of the wild west of China. Now, you need to know that in Xinjiang, you have a group of people called the Uyghur people. And the Uyghur people are Muslim, and they are not the same as the Han Chinese people. Now, there is evidence that there is a lot of there's a large crackdown right now against the Uyghur people under the auspices or the excuse of terrorism, that they basically are being put in prison camps. This doesn't mean everybody, but this is something that we should pay attention to and ask questions about. And that probably will get me blocked in China or something like that. But the main thing that you need to know is that you have all these peripheral outside provinces that have some autonomy, 5 of these autonomous regions. And there also are municipalities, meaning a city that basically has a government of its own, the major cities that you can imagine, Beijing and Nanjing and Shanghai and things like that. Okay, so those are the provinces of China. I hope it kind of helps you get your bearings a little bit. And when you see Hunan, for example, with Mao Zedong, he had some fighting in Hunan, and then he ended up going to Jiangxi, and he hid out there until he was driven further to the west on the Long March, and we'll learn all about that later when we talk about Civil War. Thanks for watching this portion, and there's more to come. Now, let's talk about why China had to eat bitterness. This obviously started centuries and thousands of years earlier, where foreigners took advantage of China in the Opium Wars, in basically the colonization that was happening. That led to a revolution against the Qing dynasty, which wasn't controlling China and wasn't protecting China from outsiders. And one of these outsiders was Japan. And when China went through the revolution, honestly, Japan had helped Sun Yat-sen, okay, Dr. Sun. He was a medical doctor, I need to tell you that. Amazingly brilliant man. So Dr. Sun actually was operating in Japan with Japan's help for a while. But just know that Japan had modernized quickly, and it was very different from China in that way. And they were a rising power. They defeated the Chinese, the Qing dynasty, in 1894 and 1895, and as a result, they got control of Taiwan. So that was called the Sino-Japanese War. And not too much later, you had the Russo-Japanese War, and the Japanese won that too. They basically sank the entire Russian fleet. And so Japan was rising as a world power, and they wanted to be a player on the world stage. As a result, they got involved immediately in World War I. Now, if you think about it, there's not a big threat to Japan from countries like Germany and Austria-Hungary. And so they fought on the side of the Allies. But there were German colonies in China. So Germany had tried to colonize as much as possible in some of the East Indies and in Africa and in parts of China. And so Japan had its eye on the German colony in the area of Qingdao, the city of Qingdao. And that is, it's a reminder to us, because I should say it makes sense to us, because now Qingdao is famous for its beer, because there were Germans there, and there was a German colony, and they made beer, and it's still going on today. So the Japanese, they wanted to get that German colony, so they jumped on board with the Allies, and then at the end of the war, at the Versailles Conference, they wanted a seat at the table, and they wanted to get that colony for good, and they wanted to carve out more of China for themselves as well. And clearly, the Chinese, who were very weak at this time and divided, because even though there was a revolution and Sun Yat-sen had been the president, remember, Yuan Shikai had taken over, and then there was actually a second revolution in 1913 to basically try and establish a united China, and this really went on all the way into the 1930s and until the war against Japan, and then after the war, the Republic of China had to move to Taiwan, right? So we're getting ahead of ourselves, and I want to just focus now on what Japan did related to China as a result of World War I. And this was a complete snub of China and China's willingness to fight with the Allies as well. They joined the war in 1917, and they did help with the Allies' war effort, but they didn't get anything at the Versailles Conference. And there is a lot of evidence that there was racism involved, that China was seen as a backwater and not trustworthy to govern, and that there could be another revolution and mess things up. Japan issued 21 demands about China, and this was extremely insulting to the people in China. And basically, they were forced to accept them because they weren't as powerful as Japan. And the League of Nations that was created, they basically allowed Japan to take parts of China and to govern China. Partly, they didn't want to mess with Japan, but they didn't see China as viable and stable. This led to what is called the May 4th incident, or the May 4th movement. And it happened on May 4th, as you can guess, 1919, after the Versailles announcement of, that they sided with Japan and China would have to accept these 21 demands. This was a turning point in Chinese history. This is what basically created communist China. And many of the students that gathered to protest, they gathered in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And that sounds familiar because, yes, Tiananmen Square was very famous on June 4th, 1989, because they were protesting against the communist government. And there was a crackdown, and those students were massacred. And it was hushed up and cleaned up by the Chinese government, and we still don't know how many thousands of people were killed. Most of them students were killed during that protest in 1989. So this is back in 1919 in Tiananmen Square, and there are students who are protesting these 21 demands and China's weakness, but also the rest of the world's unfairness. And so the idea was these imperialists, these empire builders from France and England and now Japan, they are not trustworthy, and they are just greedy, and they are thieves. So this is setting everything up for the rise of communism. The rise of communism didn't happen overnight. It took decades. And in that way, it's very similar to what happened in Vietnam and even Russia, right? Remember, Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto in the middle of the 1800s, and it took until 1917 before there was a revolution in Russia. So it takes a long time for people to embrace these wild ideas. Well, here's the thing. Communism started out, especially in Russia, as an appeal to city dwellers and workers in factories, because Russia had been industrializing and they knew the conditions were not good, and they could band together and they could put pressure on capitalists, but only if they banded together. And so, workers' parties were developed, and eventually, communism in Russia developed because of the workers in the cities, urban workers. But that didn't work as well in China. Okay, China wasn't as industrialized, but what did work is an appeal to peasants. And so that's how the two countries, the Soviet Union or Russia and China, that's how their versions of communism were different. And the two leaders that we're going to have to follow into our next unit are Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai is a very interesting figure. He's lesser known, and we'll talk about him more in a second. But just know the communists start out as student groups, and what changed everything was that Sun Yat-sen knew that things weren't working, and he turned to people like Vladimir Lenin, who had the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party in Russia. And he wanted to make a party that was similar to that. And so when he created the KMT, the Kuomintang, that was similar to Lenin's party, and it was revolutionary. Because it was revolutionary, you could have all kinds of people joining this party. And what happened is many people who were communists, they joined the KMT. Now, this is really weird because later on, the KMT and the communists were terrible enemies during the Cold War. But today, the KMT is actually seen as a communist-friendly party in Taiwan, where it still exists. And they want to have a relationship with China, whereas the other party in Taiwan doesn't want to have the same relationship. So Zhou Enlai fought with Chiang kai-shek, who was the generalissimo of the KMT's army, the National Revolutionary Army. And again, this emphasis on revolution, it's still there, and it's leading to communism. Now, there was a body, an organization called the Comintern, the Communist International, and they were promoting a spread of communism worldwide. And it was very secretive because many governments would arrest people and even, put them in prison and execute them. And so the Comintern was slowly getting its fingers into China, and it was teaching the young Chinese students about this way of thinking and how you could have revolution and change your government and essentially create a new society that would be safe from these foreign imperialists, capitalists. You could have a communist government. Let's talk a little bit about Chiang Kai-shek. We will come back to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai later when we talk about civil war. He is known as the Commandant. He was a young revolutionary, and he did fight with Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He also mingled with communist fighters because he wanted to be a rising star in the army, whatever army that was. And he became a commandant. He started his own academy called the Whampoa Academy, and it became very influential in the military and in government. And Zhou Enlai actually was a student at that academy. So, Chiang Kai-shek and Zhou Enlai were fighting together, and they were on the same team. Chiang Kai-shek was eventually known as the Generalissimo. It's just an emphasis on the fact that he was kind of like the commander-in-chief and the strong man, the dictator eventually. Well, remember that the revolution had kind of fallen apart. In fact, Sun Yat-sen, after 1911, remember he had to resign as president and Yuan Shikai became president. He had to kind of escape to Japan and regroup. And he did come back, but what ended up happening is he had his government in the south and there were rivals in the north. And it was the time where warlords were beginning to rule in the north. This is post-colonialism. If you don't understand anything else about all these names and dates and details, remember, post-colonialism is a fragmentation, it's a breaking up, and you have these warlords, you have these leaders that want to have their private armies and control their little piece of the pie. Well, Sun Yat-sen wanted a united country, but really they could only have a government in the south, and eventually Chiang kai-shek became the most powerful. He consolidated his power. He actually fought together with communists, and they went on what was called they formed the first united front, which was communists and nationalists, KMT, fighting together. And then they went north on the northern expedition to fight all those warlords and keep them from breaking China up and basically uniting China as much as they could. It didn't happen. Again, it never really happened, but this was a time where communists and nationalists were fighting together. But then Chiang Kai-shek realized that there were threats. People like Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, they were threats to him, and so he is very famous, infamous for his Shanghai massacre, basically killing communist leaders and driving them away and breaking up the communist movement and the communist army. And again, remember that the KMT had basically had a right wing, which was the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek led army, and then you had the left wing, which was the communist KMT people. It's wild to talk about this now, but there were other uprisings in Guangdong. Remember, that's Canton, that province, but those were put down by Chiang Kai-shek. And finally, he became the president all the way to 1931. But in 1931, people were realizing that he had a stranglehold on power. He was not functioning in a democratic way. And there were leaders in the country who spoke out against this. And one of them was named Lin Sun. Lin Sun became a leader who spoke out against Chiang Kai-shek because Chiang Kai-shek had put another leader in prison, and that leader was named Hu Hanming. Hu Hanming had been a leader fighting the same battles as Chiang Kai-shek, but Chiang Kai-shek saw him as a threat, and so he put that leader, Hu, in prison. And so Lin Sun, he spoke out, and Chiang Kai-shek was forced to resign. That didn't mean that he gave up power, but he resigned from being president and premier. He actually was the head of the government in two different ways. Lin Sun then became the in-between president. So he was, you could say, the fourth president of the Republic of China. And he was a wise leader. He abolished foot binding. He was trying to make things more democratic. He didn't live in fancy mansions. He was very humble. Unfortunately, Chiang Kai-shek still had power, and the rest of the world considered President Lin to just be a puppet of Chiang Kai-shek. Now, how did things change in 1932? 1931, actually. 1931, this is when Chiang Kai-shek is forced to resign and Lin Sun becomes president, but then the Japanese made a power grab. Maybe they saw the weakness and the fighting amongst these people, Chiang Kai-shek and Hu Hanming and Lin Sun and Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai and all these leaders. and the Japanese created a fairy tale, and it was called the Manchurian Incident. Remember, Manchuria is the northwest portion of, the northwest portion of China, and it is where the Qing dynasty rulers came from, and they ruled all of China, okay? So Manchuria then was taken over by Japan as a part of the 21 demands, and then Japan wanted more. They wanted to build railroads and take over factories and spread their influence and take over more provinces. And the Soviet Union also wanted to take some of that territory in Manchuria. And so Chiang Kai-shek basically was asked to come back because the people knew they needed him. They needed a military generalissimo to lead them against the Soviet Union and Japan, and to keep Manchuria from falling into foreign hands. Unfortunately, Japan was just too strong. They created a fantasy, which was the Manchurian Incident, and they created a little bang, an explosion, and it was right by the railroad. And then the leaders said, "Oh, terrorists, Chinese terrorists are blowing up the railroad, and bring in the Japanese army." And so the Japanese sent in all kinds of military forces, and it turned out it was all made up. And this was discovered in 1932 when the League of Nations, which was before the United Nations, the League of Nations did a fact-finding mission. They wanted to find out what really happened with the Manchurian Incident, and it was called the Lytton Report. Now, the leader, Victor Lytton, was actually the grandson of a very famous, actually the son of a viceroy of India, and the grandson of a very famous ruler and a governor of different places in the British Empire, and a very famous author who wrote books with Charles Dickens. Okay, so this Lytton, his name is Lytton, was a famous man from a famous family, and his report said, well, okay, we don't know exactly what happened, and basically the end result was people knew that the Japanese had made the whole thing up. That was the reason that China, which was fragmented and in a post-colonial state of disarray, they came together and united against the Japanese aggression, and really that was the beginning of World War II. I hope that this helps you. It's been a long video, but I hope that it's given you really important information to understand the good earth, to understand Chinese history and world history. Thanks for watching.